The summer of 1987 burned itself into memory like a brand, leaving scars that never quite healed. Camp Whispering Pines had been operating for nearly 30 years when 10-year-old Marcus Chin disappeared without a trace during the third week of July. The search lasted 18 days, involving state police, volunteer firefighters, and hundreds of community members who combed through every inch of the surrounding Adirondack wilderness. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Marcus had ever existed beyond the testimony of his bunkmates and the camp records that listed his arrival on July 1st. Sarah Martinez had been a 19-year-old counselor that summer, fresh out of her first year at SUNY Albany and eager to spend her breaks surrounded by pine trees and lake water instead of textbooks and lecture halls. She remembered Marcus clearly, a quiet boy with serious dark eyes who preferred sketching in his notebook to participating in Capture the Flag. He had an unusual talent for drawing, creating detailed pictures of birds and trees with a precision that seemed far beyond his years. The other kids sometimes teased him for being different, but Sarah had always made sure to include him in activities, recognizing something fragile in his careful observation of the world around him. The night Marcus vanished, Sarah had been leading a campfire sing-along when the head counselor, Jim Bradley, did the evening head count. Marcus was simply gone. His bunk was empty, his clothes still folded in his cubby, his sketchbook lying open on his pillow to a half-finished drawing of the lake at sunset. The image haunted Sarah for years afterward. The way the colored pencils had captured the exact shade of orange that painted the water each evening, as if Marcus had been trying to preserve that moment forever. The investigation consumed the remainder of that summer. Police questioned every counselor, every camper, every staff member from the kitchen workers to the maintenance crew. They dragged portions of the lake, searched the extensive cave system in the nearby hills, and followed up on dozens of tips from people claiming to have seen a small Asian boy walking along rural roads. Nothing materialized. Marcus Chun had simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only questions and the growing weight of collective guilt among those who had been responsible for his safety. Sarah finished that summer in a daze, going through the motions of her remaining counselor duties while battling nightmares and an overwhelming sense of failure. How do you lose a child? The question echoed in her mind constantly, accompanied by images of Marcus sitting alone by the lake, sketching while other children played. She had noticed his tendency to wander off by himself, but the campgrounds seemed secure, surrounded by wilderness that would quickly turn any child around and send them back toward the familiar sounds of camp life. After 1987, Sarah changed her major from elementary education to social work, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to help children in more direct ways. She graduated, found work with the County Family Services Department, and tried to build a life that felt meaningful despite the shadow of that lost summer. But Camp Whispering Pines continued to call to her, appearing in dreams and random memories triggered by the smell of wood smoke or the sound of children laughing. The camp itself struggled to recover from the incident. Enrollment dropped significantly the following year, and despite the owner's attempts to implement new safety protocols and security measures, the whispered stories of the boy who vanished continued to circulate among parents and potential campers. By 1995, Camp Whispering Pines had closed permanently, the cabins and facilities left to the gradual reclamation of the forest. Sarah had driven past the abandoned camp several times over the years, usually during her annual trips to visit her parents who had retired to a small town about 40 miles south of the old campgrounds. Each time, she felt the familiar tug of unfinished business, the nagging sense that something important had been overlooked during those frantic weeks of searching. The camp property had been sold to a private owner who seemed content to let nature take its course, and the once manicured grounds slowly returned to wilderness. In the summer of 1999, exactly 12 years after Marcus disappeared, Sarah found herself with 2 weeks of vacation time and no particular plans. Her relationship with her longtime boyfriend had recently ended, her parents were traveling in Europe, and she felt adrift in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of that summer long ago. On impulse, she decided to drive north to the Adirondacks, telling herself she wanted to do some hiking and camping, though she knew her real destination before she consciously admitted it. The road to Camp Whispering Pines had deteriorated significantly, with weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt and several trees that had fallen across the path. Sarah parked her car at the old entrance gate, which hung open on rusted hinges, and walked the remaining quarter-mile to the main camp area. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking. Buildings that had once housed dozens of laughing children now stood empty and weathered, their windows dark and some broken by falling branches or vandals. The dining hall, where she had served countless meals and led rainy day activities, had a tree growing through its roof. The arts and crafts cabin where Marcus had spent so many hours working on his drawings was missing most of its siding, revealing the skeleton of its frame. Nature was patient but relentless, and 12 years had been enough time for the forest to begin erasing the human presence from this place. Sarah spent the first day simply walking through the ruins, remembering. She found the cabin where she had lived that summer, its door hanging from one hinge, the interior filled with leaves and the debris of abandonment. The boys' cabin where Marcus had slept was in slightly better condition, perhaps because it sat on higher ground and had better drainage. She stood in the doorway, trying to reconcile her memories of the space filled with bunk beds and the chatter of children with the reality of decay and silence. The lake remained beautiful, its waters clear and surrounded by the same towering pines that had given the camp its name. Sarah sat on what remained of the old dock, watching the late afternoon light paint the water in shades of gold and orange that reminded her powerfully of Marcus's unfinished drawing. She had brought camping gear and planned to spend several days here, though she could not have articulated exactly what she hoped to accomplish. That first night, sleeping in her tent pitched near the lake shore, Sarah dreamed of Marcus for the first time in years. In the dream, he was still 10 years old, sitting by the water with his sketchbook, but when she approached him, he looked up with eyes that seemed far older than his years. He pointed toward the lake and said something she could not quite hear over the sound of wind in the trees. She woke with her heart racing and the strange conviction that he had been trying to tell her something important. The next morning, Sarah decided to explore areas of the camp that she had not visited the day before. The property extended quite far into the forest, including several outbuildings and maintenance areas that had been off-limits to campers during the camp's operational years. She found the old generator shed, its roof partially collapsed, and the groundskeeper's workshop, which still contained rusted tools and equipment abandoned when the camp closed. It was while investigating a trail that led deeper into the woods that Sarah discovered something she had never known existed during her time as a counselor. About half a mile from the main camp area, hidden by thick undergrowth and accessible only by following what appeared to be an old deer path, stood a small cabin that did not appear on any of the camp maps she remembered. The structure was different from the other camp buildings, older and more solidly built, constructed from logs that had weathered to a silver-gray color. It sat in a small clearing beside a narrow inlet of the lake, connected to the main body of water by a channel barely wide enough for a canoe. The location was incredibly secluded, invisible from the main camp area, and accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. Sarah approached the cabin cautiously, uncertain whether it might be occupied by squatters or used by hunters during the off-season. The windows were intact but too dirty to see through clearly, and the door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked much newer than the rest of the structure. She walked around the building, noting that it appeared to be in remarkably good condition compared to the deteriorating camp facilities, as if someone had been maintaining it over the years. The mystery of the cabin consumed her thoughts for the rest of that day. She had worked at Camp Whispering Pines for an entire summer and had never heard anyone mention this building. During the search for Marcus, every structure on the property had supposedly been checked, yet she could not recall any mention of this remote cabin in the police reports or search documentation. The discovery felt significant in a way she could not quite define, connected somehow to the persistent sense that something had been missed during the original investigation. That evening, Sarah drove to the nearest town and visited the local library, hoping to find historical information about the camp property. The librarian, a woman in her 60s who had lived in the area her entire life, remembered the search for Marcus and was eager to help. Together, they located newspaper archives from 1987 and several older documents related to the camp's history. What Sarah learned was fascinating and troubling. The cabin she had discovered was much older than Camp Whispering Pines itself, dating back to the 1920s when the property had been owned by a wealthy family from New York City who used it as a private retreat. The structure had originally been built as a guest house for visitors who wanted more privacy than the main lodge provided. When the property was sold to become a summer camp in the 1950s, the remote cabin had apparently been forgotten or deliberately omitted from the transaction, existing in a legal gray area that left its ownership unclear. More disturbing was the discovery that the cabin had been associated with several incidents over the years. In 1962, a camp counselor had reported seeing lights in the windows late at night, though when investigated the next day, the building appeared empty and undisturbed. In 1974, two campers claimed to have seen a man watching them from the cabin's porch during a nature hike, but camp staff found no evidence of occupancy. The incidents were dismissed as pranks or imagination, and eventually, the cabin seemed to fade from collective memory. The newspaper coverage of Marcus's disappearance made no mention of the cabin being searched, which struck Sarah as a significant oversight. If the building had been forgotten by camp administrators, it was possible that police had never been informed of its existence. The thought that Marcus might have wandered to this remote location and encountered some kind of danger there filled Sarah with a mixture of hope and dread. After 12 years of wondering, the possibility of finally learning what had happened to him was both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah returned to the camp the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. She had purchased bolt cutters in town, though she felt guilty about essentially breaking and entering. The padlock on the cabin door was substantial but not impossible to defeat, and after several minutes of work, she managed to cut through the metal loop that secured it. The door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence. Sarah stood on the threshold for a long moment, her heart pounding as she tried to see into the dim interior. The cabin consisted of a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end and what appeared to be a small kitchen area at the other. Dust particles danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the dirty windows, and the air smelled of old wood and something else she could not immediately identify. As her eyes adjusted to the low light, Sarah began to make out details that made her blood run cold. The cabin was not empty. Furniture covered with white sheets filled the space, giving it the appearance of a room frozen in time. But it was the walls that truly shocked her. Every available surface was covered with drawings, hundreds of them, executed in colored pencil and crayon with a style that was unmistakably familiar. Sarah stepped inside, her legs trembling as she approached the nearest wall. The drawings were all of the same subject matter that had filled Marcus's sketchbook 12 years ago. Birds, trees, lake scenes, and wildlife rendered with extraordinary detail and skill. But these pictures showed a progression, a development of technique that suggested they had been created over a period of years. The earliest drawings, clustered near the door, showed the same level of ability Marcus had possessed as a 10-year-old. But as Sarah moved deeper into the room, the artwork became increasingly sophisticated, showing the development of an artist who had continued to grow and learn. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If these drawings had been created by Marcus, then he had not died in 1987. He had been here, in this hidden cabin, for years after his disappearance. But where was he now? And who had been keeping him here? Sarah forced herself to examine the cabin more systematically, looking for clues about its recent use. The kitchen area contained canned goods with expiration dates from the mid-1990s, suggesting that someone had been provisioning the space regularly until relatively recently. A small bedroom area behind a curtain contained a narrow bed with rumpled sheets and a dresser filled with clothes in various sizes, as if they had been purchased to accommodate a growing child. But it was what she found in a wooden crate beside the bed that finally broke her composure. Inside were dozens of Marcus's original drawings from camp, including the unfinished sunset picture that had been left on his pillow the night he disappeared. Beneath the artwork were other personal items: a small wooden carving he had been working on in crafts class, a friendship bracelet made by one of his bunkmates, and a letter addressed to his parents that he had never had the chance to send. Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the evidence surrounding her. Marcus had definitely been in this cabin, but the timeline suggested by the progression of artwork on the walls was deeply disturbing. Someone had taken him from his bunk that night in 1987 and brought him to this isolated location. For years, they had kept him here, allowing him to continue drawing while cutting him off from the outside world and everyone who loved him. The sound of a car engine in the distance snapped Sarah back to the present. Through the dirty window, she could see a pickup truck making its way slowly along the overgrown access road that led to the cabin. Panic flooded through her as she realized that whoever had been maintaining this place was returning, and she was trapped inside with evidence of a crime that had gone undetected for 12 years. Sarah quickly gathered several of Marcus's drawings and personal items, stuffing them into her backpack along with her camera, which she had used to document the cabin's contents. The truck was getting closer, and she could hear the engine struggling with the rough terrain. There was no way she could reach her own car without being seen, so she slipped out the back of the cabin and into the thick forest that surrounded the clearing. From her hiding place behind a large pine tree, Sarah watched as the truck came to a stop beside the cabin. The driver who emerged was a man she recognized, though it took her a moment to place him. Jim Bradley had been the head counselor at Camp Whispering Pines in 1987, the man who had discovered Marcus missing during the evening head count. He was older now, his hair gray and his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking his identity. Jim approached the cabin and immediately noticed the broken padlock lying on the ground. His reaction was not surprise but anger, and he began searching the area around the building with the systematic efficiency of someone familiar with the location. Sarah pressed herself deeper into the shadows, hardly daring to breathe as Jim's search brought him closer to her hiding spot. After several tense minutes, Jim returned to his truck and retrieved a cell phone. Sarah could not hear his conversation clearly, but his tone was urgent and angry. He was calling someone, reporting the break-in and requesting instructions. The call lasted only a few minutes, after which Jim entered the cabin and began moving around inside, apparently checking to see what might have been disturbed or taken. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in Sarah's mind, creating a picture so horrifying that she struggled to accept it. Jim Bradley had been responsible for Marcus's disappearance, using his position of authority to remove the boy from camp and bring him to this hidden location. But why? And what had happened to Marcus in the years since 1987? Jim emerged from the cabin carrying a large duffel bag, which he loaded into his truck before driving away. Sarah waited until the sound of the engine had completely faded before leaving her hiding place. She needed to get back to her car and contact the police immediately, but she also knew that she needed more evidence than just her word and a few drawings to convince authorities to take action after 12 years. The drive back to town felt endless, Sarah's mind racing with questions and implications. She had stumbled upon evidence of a crime that had destroyed multiple lives, not just Marcus's, but his family's as well. His parents had spent 12 years not knowing whether their son was alive or dead, grieving without closure, and probably blaming themselves for sending him to camp that summer. At the local police station, Sarah was initially met with skepticism. The desk sergeant listened to her story with polite but obvious doubt, clearly thinking she was either mistaken or possibly unstable. It was only when she produced Marcus's drawings and personal items from her backpack that his attitude changed. The artwork was too distinctive and too closely matched the police files from 1987 to be dismissed as coincidence. Detective Ray Morrison had been a young officer during the original investigation into Marcus's disappearance, and he remembered the case clearly. Now nearing retirement, he studied the evidence Sarah had brought with intense focus, occasionally comparing details to photographs in the old case file. The progression of artistic skill shown in the drawings was particularly compelling, suggesting that Marcus had indeed survived his disappearance and continued developing his talents over several years. Within hours, a team of investigators was assembled to return to the cabin. Sarah accompanied them, serving as a guide to the remote location and providing details about what she had observed. The cabin was empty when they arrived, but the evidence it contained was overwhelming. In addition to the artwork covering the walls, investigators found journals hidden beneath loose floorboards, written in Marcus's handwriting and documenting years of captivity. The journals painted a picture of psychological manipulation and control that was heartbreaking to read. Marcus had been told that his parents no longer wanted him, that he had been abandoned at camp because he was different and difficult. Jim Bradley had presented himself as a rescuer, someone who understood and appreciated Marcus's artistic talents in ways that others did not. Over time, Marcus had become dependent on his captor, afraid to leave the cabin even when opportunities presented themselves. The most recent journal entries, dated from 1995, suggested that Marcus had finally begun to question the narrative he had been fed. He wrote about memories of his parents that contradicted what Jim had told him, and about a growing desire to return to the outside world. The journal ended abruptly in the middle of an entry, with no explanation for why the writing stopped. A statewide manhunt was launched for Jim Bradley, but he seemed to have vanished as completely as Marcus had 12 years earlier. His truck was found abandoned at a bus station 3 states away, and despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, no trace of him could be found. The investigation expanded to include other missing children cases from camps and youth programs where Jim had worked over the years, revealing a pattern of suspicious incidents that had never been connected. But the question that haunted everyone involved in the case was what had happened to Marcus after 1995. The cabin showed no signs of occupancy after that time, and despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, no trace of him could be found. Had Jim killed him when he became too difficult to control? Had Marcus finally escaped, only to die in the wilderness? Or was he somehow still alive, living under an assumed identity somewhere far from the Adirondacks? Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm as news of the discovery broke. The story of the boy who had vanished from summer camp and been held captive for years captured national attention, with reporters and television crews descending on the small town near Camp Whispering Pines. Marcus's parents, now in their 60s, flew in from California where they had moved after their son's disappearance, desperate for any information about what had happened to their child. Meeting Marcus's parents was one of the most difficult experiences of Sarah's life. David and Linda Chun had aged far beyond their years, their faces marked by the permanent grief of parents who had lost a child. They thanked her repeatedly for never giving up, for returning to the camp, and making the discovery that had finally provided some answers. But Sarah could see in their eyes the same question that tormented her. Where was Marcus now? The investigation continued for months, with teams of specialists analyzing every piece of evidence found in the cabin. Forensic psychologists studied Marcus's journals and artwork, looking for clues about his mental state and possible intentions. The drawings from his later years showed increasing sophistication but also darker themes, with images of caged birds and shadowy figures that suggested his psychological state had deteriorated over time. DNA evidence found in the cabin confirmed that Marcus had indeed lived there for an extended period, but it also revealed something unexpected. Mixed with Marcus's DNA were traces from another person, someone whose genetic profile did not match Jim Bradley or anyone else in the law enforcement databases. This suggested that Marcus might not have been Jim's only victim, that there might have been other children held in the cabin over the years. The possibility that there were other victims led to a massive expansion of the investigation. Cold case files from across the northeastern United States were reviewed, looking for missing children cases that might be connected to Jim Bradley's movements over the past several decades. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Jim had worked at youth camps, schools, and recreation programs in multiple states, always moving on after a year or two, often just before or after a child went missing in the area. Sarah found herself unable to return to her normal life, while so many questions remained unanswered. She took extended leave from her job and dedicated herself to helping with the investigation, using her social work background to assist with the psychological aspects of the case. She also worked closely with Marcus's parents, helping them navigate the complex emotions of learning that their son had survived his initial disappearance only to face years of captivity and an uncertain fate. The breakthrough came almost a year after Sarah's initial discovery, when a hiker found human remains in a remote area of the Adirondack wilderness, about 15 miles from the cabin. The bones were those of a young person, and dental records confirmed what everyone had feared. Marcus Chun had died sometime in the mid-1990s, probably around the time his journal entries stopped. The forensic examination revealed that Marcus had died from exposure, suggesting that he had either escaped from the cabin or been abandoned there during a harsh winter. The location where his remains were found was along a trail that led away from the camp area toward a small town, indicating that he might have been trying to find his way back to civilization when he succumbed to the elements. The discovery brought a measure of closure to Marcus's family, though it also confirmed their worst fears. He had survived his initial disappearance and lived for several more years, meaning that there had been time for rescue, if only someone had known where to look. The guilt that Sarah felt was overwhelming. Even though she rationally understood that she could not have known about the cabin's existence during the original search. Jim Bradley was never found, despite one of the most extensive manhunts in the region's history. He had apparently spent years planning his escape, establishing false identities and financial resources that allowed him to disappear completely when the cabin was discovered. Law enforcement agencies across the country continued to search for him, but as months turned into years, the likelihood of finding him alive diminished. The case had far-reaching implications for youth programs and summer camps across the country. New regulations were implemented requiring more thorough background checks for staff members and better oversight of camp properties. The story of Marcus Chun became a cautionary tale used in training programs for counselors and administrators, a reminder of how easily predators could exploit positions of trust and authority. For Sarah, the experience fundamentally changed her understanding of her role in the world. She left her job with County Family Services and established a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing children. The Marcus Chun Foundation, as it came to be known, worked with law enforcement agencies and families to keep old cases active and pursue new leads that might emerge years or even decades after a child's disappearance. The Foundation's first major success came 3 years after Marcus's remains were found, when investigators following up on the DNA evidence from the cabin identified another victim. A girl who had disappeared from a camp in Vermont in 1983 was linked to Jim Bradley through employment records and witness testimony. Her remains were eventually found in a different location, but the connection helped establish a timeline of Jim's activities that spanned more than 2 decades. Over the years, Sarah returned to the abandoned camp Whispering Pines many times, often bringing law enforcement officials or families of other missing children who hoped to find clues in the ruins. The cabin where Marcus had been held was eventually demolished, but not before every inch of it had been documented and analyzed. The main camp buildings continued to decay, slowly being reclaimed by the forest that had always surrounded them. Each visit brought new reflections on the summer of 1987 and the boy who had disappeared during her watch. Sarah often wondered what Marcus might have become if he had been allowed to grow up normally, whether his artistic talents would have led him to a career in art or design. The drawings he had created during his captivity showed remarkable skill and sensitivity, suggesting that even under the worst circumstances, his creative spirit had never been completely broken. The impact of Marcus's story extended beyond the immediate investigation and the changes it brought to youth programs. His case became part of the larger conversation about child safety and the need for communities to remain vigilant about protecting their most vulnerable members. The fact that he had been held captive for years in a location that was never searched during the original investigation highlighted how easy it was for predators to hide in plain sight. Sarah's work with the Foundation brought her into contact with dozens of families who had experienced similar tragedies, parents and siblings who had been left to wonder what had happened to their loved ones. Each case was unique, but they all shared the common thread of lives interrupted and families torn apart by predators who exploited positions of trust and authority. The psychological impact of her discovery at the cabin stayed with Sarah for years. She underwent therapy to deal with the trauma of finding evidence of Marcus's captivity and the guilt she felt about not having found him sooner. The therapist helped her understand that she had been a teenager herself in 1987, with no reason to suspect that the head counselor was anything other than what he appeared to be. But perhaps the most profound impact of the experience was the way it changed Sarah's relationship with memory and the past. She had learned that the stories we tell ourselves about what happened are often incomplete, that there are always hidden layers and forgotten details that can change everything we thought we knew. The cabin in the woods had existed all along, just waiting for someone to stumble upon its secrets. The annual memorial service for Marcus Chun became an important event in the small town near Camp Whispering Pines, drawing together law enforcement officials, volunteers who had participated in the original search, and families of other missing children. Sarah always attended, often speaking about the importance of never giving up hope and continuing to ask questions even when cases seemed hopeless. During one such memorial service, nearly 10 years after her discovery of the cabin, Sarah was approached by a young man who introduced himself as David Chun Jr., Marcus's younger brother. He had been only 5 years old when Marcus disappeared, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to be affected by the trauma that had consumed his family. David Jr. had grown up in the shadow of his missing brother, watching his parents struggle with grief and uncertainty for most of his childhood. He told Sarah that her discovery of the cabin and the subsequent investigation had finally allowed his family to begin healing, even though the answers they found were not the ones they had hoped for. Knowing what had happened to Marcus, even though it was tragic, was better than spending the rest of their lives wondering. The conversation with David Jr. reminded Sarah of why her work was so important. The families of missing children needed answers, even when those answers were painful. The uncertainty of not knowing was often worse than the grief of confirmed loss, because it prevented families from moving through the natural process of mourning and healing. As the years passed, Sarah continued to receive occasional updates about the search for Jim Bradley. There were reported sightings from time to time, usually in remote areas of the country where someone matching his description had been seen. But none of these leads ever panned out, and it became increasingly likely that he had died somewhere in the wilderness, taking his secrets with him. The Marcus Chin Foundation grew steadily, eventually expanding to work on missing children cases across the country. Sarah hired other investigators and social workers, many of whom had personal connections to similar cases. The foundation's success rate was modest but meaningful, helping to solve several cold cases and bringing closure to families who had waited years or decades for answers. One of the foundation's most important contributions was the development of new protocols for searching camp and school properties when children went missing. The oversight that had allowed the cabin to be missed during the original search for Marcus was not unique, and similar hidden structures had been found at other locations where children had disappeared. The Foundation worked with law enforcement agencies to create comprehensive search procedures that would ensure no building or area was overlooked. Sarah never married or had children of her own, dedicating her life instead to the work of finding missing children and supporting their families. She often wondered if this choice was related to her experience with Marcus, whether the guilt and responsibility she felt had made it impossible for her to imagine taking on the role of parent herself. But she found fulfillment in her work and in the knowledge that she was making a difference in the lives of families facing unimaginable tragedy. The abandoned Camp Whispering Pines eventually became a nature preserve, with the ruins of the buildings serving as a reminder of the complex history of the site. A small memorial to Marcus Chun was installed near the lake where he had loved to sit and draw, featuring one of his artwork pieces reproduced in bronze. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for families of missing children and for those who worked in child protection services. 25 years after Marcus's disappearance, Sarah published a book about the case and her subsequent work with missing children. The book, titled Hidden in Plain Sight, became a bestseller and helped raise awareness about the ongoing problem of child abduction and exploitation. The proceeds from the book were donated to the Marcus Chin Foundation, allowing it to expand its work even further. In the book's final chapter, Sarah reflected on the lessons she had learned from her experience at Camp Whispering Pines. She wrote about the importance of listening to instincts, of asking questions when something feels wrong, and of never accepting that a missing child case is truly closed. She also emphasized the resilience of the human spirit, noting how Marcus had continued to create beautiful art even under the most horrific circumstances. The story of Marcus Chun and the hidden cabin in the woods became part of the folklore of the Adirondack region, a cautionary tale told around campfires and in classrooms. But for those who had known Marcus personally, he remained more than just a cautionary tale. He was a talented, sensitive child whose life had been cut short by evil, but whose memory continued to inspire efforts to protect other children from similar fates. Sarah's final visit to the site of Camp Whispering Pines came on the 30th anniversary of Marcus's disappearance. She was in her 60s by then, her hair gray and her face lined with the experiences of 3 decades spent working with families in crisis. The forest had almost completely reclaimed the camp buildings, with only foundations and scattered debris marking where hundreds of children had once spent their summers. Standing by the memorial beside the lake, Sarah thought about the 10-year-old boy who had sat in this same spot 30 years earlier, sketching the sunset and dreaming of a future that would never come. She thought about all the children who had been saved by the work that grew out of his tragedy, and about the families who had found closure through the foundation that bore his name. The sun was setting as Sarah prepared to leave, painting the lake in the same golden colors that Marcus had tried to capture in his final drawing at camp. As she walked back toward her car, she could almost hear the echoes of children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, a reminder of the joy and innocence that places like this were meant to protect. The mystery of what had happened to Marcus Chun had been solved, but the larger questions about protecting children and preventing such tragedies remained as relevant as ever. Sarah's work would continue, carried on by the foundation she had built and the protocols she had helped develop. The hidden cabin in the woods was gone, but the vigilance it had taught them to maintain would endure. In her final report to the board of the Marcus Chun Foundation, Sarah wrote that the most important lesson of the case was that evil often hides behind familiar faces and trusted institutions. The very people entrusted with children's safety could sometimes be the greatest threat to their well-being. But she also emphasized that communities had the power to protect their children when they remained alert, asked difficult questions, and refused to accept easy explanations for troubling events. The story of Marcus Chun served as a permanent reminder that the price of children's safety was eternal vigilance, and that sometimes the most important discoveries came from those who refused to let sleeping mysteries lie. Sarah Martinez had been a 19-year-old counselor when she first failed to protect Marcus, but she had spent the rest of her life ensuring that his disappearance would lead to better protection for countless other children. The lake at Camp Whispering Pines continued to reflect the changing sky, its waters holding the memory of a boy who had loved to capture its beauty in colored pencil drawings. Though Marcus was gone, his story lived on in the work of those who had been touched by his tragedy, ensuring that his brief life had meaning beyond the circumstances of his death. The hidden cabin had finally given up its secrets, but the lessons it taught about vigilance, persistence, and the protection of innocence would endure for generations to come.